I froze when I saw a strange man place a ring on my wife's hand at the couple's dinner. The scene didn't seem real. It was as if I'd been transported outside my body, watching from afar, like a spectator in a tragedy I hadn't written, but in which I was the protagonist. She smiled, shyly, moved, as if that gesture were the culmination of a beautiful love story. And there I was, with my mouth dry, my heart racing, with an absurd urge to scream, to run, to wake up. But there was no sleep. This was real. I simply took a photo with trembling hands, got up from the table pretending to go to the bathroom, and waited for time to pass until we could leave. The scene echoed in my mind like a nightmare repeating itself in slow motion. I replayed the way she looked at him, how she accepted the ring, how she caressed his hand. It was a gesture of surrender. That surrender had once been mine, but now it had a new owner. And worse, she seemed happy. When we got home, I didn't have the strength to scream or cry. I just showed her the photo, without saying a word. She was silent for seconds that felt like hours. Her face fell. She tried to deny it at first, mumbling something about it being a misunderstanding, an impulsive moment, but when she realized there was no more room for lies, she simply lowered her eyes and said, "I'm in love with him." The words were cold blades piercing my chest. There was no fury. There was no outrage. Only pain. A raw, heavy, silent pain. The pain of realizing that the person you loved most in your life now loves someone else. That embrace, that home, that scent on the pillow, everything you built and protected as if it were an extension of your own body, was now another man's. I could have demanded explanations, fought, humiliated myself, maybe even begged for a second chance. But her gaze, that gaze was no longer mine. So I said, my voice low, almost a whisper, struggling not to break down, "I hope you're happy with your choice, but know that I loved you with all my heart." I turned my back, not knowing exactly where to go, but certain that I no longer belonged there. That night, I died in parts. I was dismantled. And from that moment on, I began to walk among the pieces of what was left of me. There were months of silence, sleepless nights, memories that came unbidden. I remembered the way she folded her clothes, the way she smiled when she saw me coming home, the times she'd rest her head on my shoulder during movies. I remembered the smell of coffee in the morning, the messages with little hearts throughout the day, the plans for having children, traveling, growing old together. I remembered everything, as if my mind wanted to torture me, remind me that I had everything, and now I had nothing. But time, that merciless and wise craftsman, slowly mended the tears. It didn't erase the pain, but it taught me to walk with it. Little by little, I began to breathe again, to smile without weight. And then, I met another woman. It wasn't a hurricane, it was a breeze. A calm that arrived slowly, unhurriedly, without promising anything. And without realizing it, I began to relearn how to trust, how to love, how to exist outside the shadow of a painful past. As I blossomed, I learned from acquaintances that my ex-wife was no longer with the man she'd left me for. I heard vague, conflicting stories. That he'd left. That she was different. But I didn't listen. Not out of indifference, but because I'd learned that looking forward is the only way to avoid stumbling over what's already happened. The new woman who entered my life brought peace. She looked at me as if she saw my soul. She didn't demand, she didn't pressure, she just stayed there, present, whole. And that, somehow, healed me. Made me feel worthy of love again. Until, on a rainy, cold afternoon, months after our final goodbye, someone knocked on my door. And when I opened it, I saw that familiar face, but now thinner, more tired, more human. She stood there, before me, as if time had stopped. She said nothing for a few seconds. She just looked at me, her eyes begging for forgiveness even before the words. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "You truly loved me with your all, and no one else has loved me like that." Those words hit me hard. Not because there was still love, but because there, in that moment, I understood what she had lost. I understood the depth of the emptiness she carried. And I understood that, despite everything, I forgave her. But forgiveness isn't a bridge back. It's just a path to freedom. And when she tried to make amends, when her hand brushed mine, when her eyes sought mine with that silent plea, I didn't hesitate. I smiled sadly and said, "It's too late now." She didn't cry, at least not in front of me. She just nodded, as if she understood the price of her own choice. And then she turned and walked away. I watched her walk away down the wet, small, distant street, and I realized that a chapter of my life ended there. A chapter full of pain, love, and learning. A chapter that, if I could, I would have written differently. But now, finally, it was over. Time passed. Life went on. Peace returned. And sometimes, on silent nights, I wonder if she remembers our story. If that couple's dinner comes to mind the way it does to mine. If she still wonders what it would have been like if she'd chosen differently. And I wonder, what did she see in that other man that made her abandon everything? And what does she feel now, seeing what she lost? Because sometimes, losing the love of your life doesn't hurt so much in the moment of departure, but in the days that follow, when you realize no one else looks at you the way he did. But what she saw, and what happened to him, perhaps only she can say. And it was there, in that last exchange of glances, that I understood, there are choices that cannot be undone, and there are hearts that, once broken, rebuild themselves in other directions. Because love isn't just what we feel. It's what we do with what we feel. And some understand this too late. But what exactly led her to seek me out? Why only after so long, after so much silence, did she return with eyes filled with pain? What happened between her and that man that made her realize the value of what she had lost? And what did I do with that forgiveness she so desperately asked for? Does everything truly end, or are there bonds that are never completely broken? These answers, only those who have lived them know. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal. On the contrary, our stories show with intensity how betrayal destroys homes, feelings, and lives. All narratives are fictional, but based on real emotions, with the sole purpose of making it clear that cheating is choosing to lose what is most precious, true love. Get ready, what you're about to hear now is shocking, painful and unforgettable. Let the story begin. His name was Daniel, and she was Laura. A couple who, at first glance, seemed to have been designed with the perfect lines of harmony and mature love. They met in their early 20s, when life was still more dream than scar, more project than routine. The connection between them was as quick as it was natural, the kind that doesn't require long introductions or rehearsed gestures. It was as if souls had met before the first touch of hands. The first months were intense, passionate, deeply exchanged glances, and a mutual surrender that bordered on the sacred. But what set their relationship apart from others wasn't the overwhelming passion at the beginning, but the calm that came later. Laura had a serene gaze, spoke softly when she wanted to be heard, and loved to attend to small details. Daniel was more reserved, but one only had to observe the way he held her hand in traffic, or how he fixed her hair during a conversation, to understand that there was true love there. They were the kind of couple many silently envy, balanced, friends, life partners. Over time, life began to revolve around them, not the other way around. They lived in a quiet neighborhood with a sweeping view of the city from their balcony. They had built their home calmly, piece by piece, choosing each piece of furniture carefully, painting the walls together on weekends, laughing at the mess, arguing over shades of blue and gray for the bedroom, learning that sharing their daily lives was, in fact, a silent act of love. Their trips weren't luxurious, but they were full of meaning. With each new destination, they brought back a memory and a story, which would end up somewhere on a shelf or framed on the wall. Friends said they complemented each other. They were different enough to challenge each other and similar enough not to lose themselves in each other. Daniel worked as a graphic designer, with a home office he kept impeccably, and Laura was a psychologist, working in an elegant clinic a few blocks away. Their routines didn't overlap all the time, but they knew how to respect each other's space. She understood his creative silences, and he knew when she needed to be alone after listening to painful stories all day. They weren't perfect. There were irritable days, impatient nights, thoughtless gestures, arguments over trivial matters. But there were also silent reconciliations, breakfasts made without warning, notes stuck on the refrigerator door with short but loving phrases. Their life together was built, not just lived. Laura had a refined sense of empathy. She had a generous way of listening, but also a surprising firmness. She knew how to take a stand, say no, and set boundaries. She had a gift for making others feel seen, and Daniel always said she was his home. He, on the other hand, was a discreet, observant man, with a sensitivity few knew. He preferred to listen rather than speak, and his words, when spoken, carried a rare weight. The kind of person who didn't need grand gestures to demonstrate love, his affection was in the small, everyday actions, in the attentive eyes, in the care for the other. And it was in this balance between depth and lightness that the years passed. After 5 years of marriage, they decided to throw a small party to celebrate. They gathered their closest friends, family, and co-workers. The house was decorated with scented candles, a soft soundtrack filled the rooms, and the look between them was one of complicity. The party was praised by everyone. "You two are an exemplary couple," someone said that night, and they smiled silently, as if they knew they were on the right path. They had plans to buy a bigger house, to adopt a dog, to perhaps, at some point, consider having children. But nothing was forced between them, each decision was made calmly, respectfully, and with mutual listening. On her days off, Laura liked to cook something new and put on a light playlist in the kitchen, while Daniel would appear mid-preparation with a glass of wine and a sarcastic comment. They teased each other, laughed, and exchanged loving glances. To outsiders, there were no cracks in their relationship. Daniel always enjoyed capturing moments. He was the type who filmed Laura dancing alone in the living room, made short videos of her hands stirring her coffee, or of her hurriedly combing her hair. He saved everything in folders on his computer, in digital albums, as if to freeze moments of a love he believed would be eternal. Laura, on the other hand, was more reserved. She didn't show it as much on social media, she didn't expose her relationship, but in every daily gesture, there was an intense presence, as if she were saying, without words, that this was where she wanted to be. And for a long time, it was. The nights were filled with long conversations, shared movies, and discussions about politics, art, and people. They shared interests, but also provoked each other with differing points of view. They never stopped talking. Laura always said that what kills a couple is not the absence of love, but the lack of communication. And Daniel, though more reserved, made a point of listening to her until the end, even when he disagreed. That was what made them strong, the respect that existed between them. When one of them was down, the other held them together. When one was tired, the other picked up the slack. And even in the most difficult times, they knew home was a refuge, not a battlefield. It had been that way from the beginning, and it seemed like it would be forever. Laura started attending a couples group with Daniel on Thursday nights. They were dinners with mutual friends, a time to socialize, share ideas, stories, and life experiences. Each meeting brought something new, a game, a dynamic, a deeper conversation. Laura loved those dinners. She said it was a way to escape the routine without having to leave each other. Daniel sometimes found the meetings a bit repetitive, but he went because he saw the sparkle in her eyes. He felt proud to see how much she was admired by the other women, as if she were a silent beacon of balance. They stood out from the rest. There were couples there going through obvious crises, others stuck in lukewarm relationships. But Daniel and Laura seemed to float on another level. At least, that was the impression everyone had. And, for a while, that was what they believed they were, too. There were days, however, when Daniel noticed Laura was more distant. There wasn't an explicit change, but something in her silences had shifted. It wasn't a lack of love, but perhaps the weight of time, of life's demands, of routine. He began to notice that she spent more time on her phone, that she came home with a more vacant look in her eyes, less present. She was still affectionate, but something was off. Daniel, however, wasn't the type to demand or pressure. He had learned that everyone has phases, moments of introspection, and he believed that Laura, being who she was, would always be honest. And perhaps that's why he never asked directly. He just observed. And he loved. Even on days when she seemed distant, he made a point of having her coffee ready, of sending her a text in the middle of the day, of reminding her of important dates. It was his way of saying, "I'm here, even if you're somewhere else." Laura, on the other hand, was torn between a feeling of profound gratitude and an emptiness she couldn't yet name. Her relationship with Daniel was good, stable, solid. But something inside her was restless, as if time were demanding a move she hadn't yet made. She felt confused some days, overwhelmed on others. She didn't know if it was fatigue, if it was just a phase, or if there was something that truly needed to be confronted. And, like a good therapist, she tried to rationalize, explain, find answers. But the heart doesn't always follow logic. And feelings, even when unspoken, find ways to manifest themselves. And, without realizing it, Laura began to slowly withdraw. It started with vague glances, then automatic smiles, until some kisses became just habit, not desire. Daniel, who knew her every feature, felt it. But you chose to trust. You always did. And then the day of that dinner arrived. Just another one among many, in the same cozy restaurant, with the same lively group, the same repeated jokes, the same exchanged glances. But that night, something was about to change. Daniel didn't know it yet, but in that encounter, life as he knew it would give way to something completely different. Laura's absence that night would no longer be just emotional. And everything he thought he knew, everything they had built with care, affection, and respect, would be put to the test in a split second. But until that moment, he still believed in forever. I still believed that love endured everything. I still believed that love was enough. Daniel woke up before Laura every day. It was a silent habit he maintained with affection, almost like a ritual. He'd make her coffee, heat her milk to just the right temperature, leave her favorite mug next to the folded napkin, and put on a soft playlist to play quietly in the kitchen. Sometimes he'd leave a note, sometimes just a kiss on the forehead before heading out for a brisk walk before work. Laura, even sleepy, noticed these gestures, but lately, her reaction was more automatic than felt. Life continued at the same pace, but something had shifted, even if still imperceptible to outsiders. Daniel was beginning to notice subtle nuances, the more distant tone in her conversations, the lack of spontaneous laughter, the way she avoided certain topics or feigned interest in others. There were times when he felt he was talking to someone who was only physically present. Still, he avoided creating conflict, preferring to believe it was just a phase, like so many others they had endured together. On Wednesdays, Laura started arriving home from the clinic a little later. She said she'd increased her patient load, which made sense, considering her recent growth in reputation as a therapist. Daniel suspected nothing, not because he was naive, but because he deeply believed in the bond they'd built. He trusted her with blind faith and, above all, wanted her to be happy. He started preparing more elaborate dinners at home, buying different wines, suggesting movies she'd always liked, and even when she said she was exhausted and would rather take a shower and sleep, he respected her. Sometimes he stayed late at the office, pretending to work but actually reviewing old photos, listening to audio files saved on his phone, trying to understand if something had gone missing and, if so, when it had started. There was a silent loneliness growing inside him, which still had no name, but was already keeping him awake for nights on end. Laura, on the other hand, felt torn. She loved what Daniel represented, what they had built, the generous man he was. But there was a growing unease within her, a feeling of being in another place emotionally. The presence of someone new had begun unpretentiously. One of the regulars at the couple's dinners, someone polite, perceptive, possessed of a quiet charm and attentiveness that stood out among the others. Initially, it was just a pleasant exchange, a deeper conversation here, a compliment there, lingering glances that seemed innocent but carried another layer of tension. Laura hadn't planned anything. But, like many emotional mistakes, it built slowly, nameless, shapeless, until, before she knew it, she had already become emotionally involved. It frightened her, but it also made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. And instead of facing the conflict, she allowed herself to continue living that dilemma in silence, balancing between two worlds, as if it were possible not to break either. Thursday dinners became a territory fraught with hidden tension. Daniel noticed that Laura was more dressed up, spending more time in front of the mirror, choosing different dresses. When he complimenting her, she smiled only with her lips. There was a sparkle in her eyes, yes, but it wasn't meant for him. Sitting next to her, Daniel felt disconnected, as if watching from the outside a relationship that was once his. The details began to tell stories she wasn't telling. And even without proof, without hearing anything, without catching anything, he began to feel, with pain and certainty, that he was no longer alone with her in that relationship. One day, when he saw her cell phone vibrating on the table, a name he didn't recognize flashed on the screen. It wasn't a compromising message, but the way Laura immediately grabbed the device and turned it face down, as if protecting something she doesn't want to show, lit an uncomfortable flame within him. That night, he didn't sleep. The following week, Laura invited him to a special dinner with the couple's group. He said the event would have a new dynamic, something more sophisticated, different from their usual get-togethers. Daniel hesitated, but agreed. He dressed nicely, chose a shirt she had given him, and tried to appear present and open. They arrived at the restaurant, and everything seemed the same, but the atmosphere was different. Laura moved away more often, speaking in whispers to the man in question, and although it was all very subtle, Daniel knew. He knew it by the way their eyes met, by the time she stayed away from the table, by the light touch on his shoulder when she returned. It was all too careful, and yet, too visible to the one he loved. Daniel was beginning to grow silent inside, the inner voice that had previously screamed for explanations now simply retreating. He felt ashamed, angry at himself for still being there, trying to hold together a structure that had clearly already collapsed. The climax of that night, however, would come without warning. Amidst laughter, toasts, and idle chatter, an unexpected gesture froze time. The man, in front of everyone, took a small velvet box from his pocket and, with a restrained smile, placed a ring on Laura's hand. The room fell silent for a few seconds, confused, trying to understand what was happening. Laura smiled, a fragile, hesitant smile, and yet, she accepted the gesture. Daniel didn't have time to react. He took out his cell phone, recorded the image, rose from his chair without saying a word, and walked away. He walked down the street aimlessly, feeling the world spin in slow motion. The image of the ring, her hand accepting it, her eyes looking sweetly at another man, it was all more than just a scene, it was the cruel confirmation of a suspicion he'd been stifling for weeks. When Laura arrived home hours later, he was already sitting on the couch, the light off, his gaze lost. She hesitated at the door, unsure whether to say something or feign normalcy. Daniel simply showed her the photo on his phone. There was nothing more to say. Her defenses fell. The words came rushing out, amid attempts to justify, deny, and explain herself. But no explanation could erase that image. And then, her voice nearly muffled, she admitted, she was in love with someone else. Daniel didn't cry. He just felt something inside him shatter with force, like glass shattering beyond repair. He heard what he needed to hear, and that was enough. He stood up, grabbed a suitcase he had already packed in silence, and before leaving, said in a firm but pained voice, "I hope you're happy with your choice, but know that I loved you with all my heart." He left the house with his heart in ruins. The home he had built had become just a house. The plans, the promises, the albums, the notes, everything had dissolved in one night. And as he walked the empty streets, between lit streetlights and cold shadows, he felt he had lost not only the woman he loved, but also himself, in parts. Betrayal wasn't just the act of choosing another. It was the silence, the distance, the lack of courage to speak up beforehand, the choice to lie for too long. And even though there were no shouts or arguments, the sound of disappointment deafened within. The next day, Laura woke up alone. His absence was physical, but the pain was different. It was as if something essential had vanished into thin air. She walked around the house as if in an unfamiliar place. She sat on the sofa where he usually lay with his head in her lap. She looked at the cup of coffee he always made. It was at that moment that regret began to emerge, timidly, still uncomprehended, still confused, but real. On the other side of town, Daniel was starting over. Still unsure how, still with a broken heart. But something kept driving him on. Walking with the broken pieces. What he didn't yet know was that hadn't been the greatest pain. There was still something to come. A secret that would change everything he thought about the love he thought he knew. And when that secret came to light, there would be no more room for illusions. Or for turning back. It was weeks of silence. After that night Daniel walked out the door with his suitcase packed and his eyes broken. He didn't return any messages, didn't answer calls, didn't want to hear excuses or empty promises. He temporarily stayed in a small apartment and, day after day, fought the ghosts of what had happened, trying to relearn how to inhabit a world where Laura was no longer his point of balance. The memories still heard in waves, especially on the quieter nights, when everything around him went silent and only memory made noise. There was anger, yes, but the most intense feeling was emptiness, a living absence, a wound that moved with him. He still loved, but he no longer knew what to do with that love. It was loose, aimless, lost. Meanwhile, Laura lived in silent mourning. She tried to maintain her routine, but every object in the house felt like a cruel reminder. It wasn't regret for what she'd felt with the other man, it was for what she destroyed, for not having the courage to face what she felt before crossing a line she shouldn't have. And, more than anything, it was for what she lost in Daniel, the peace, the care, the silent love he gave every day without asking for anything in return. The man she had been involved with, the one who awakened something in her that she mistook for love, was no longer as present as before. In the first few days after her breakup with Daniel, he appeared frequently, bringing flowers, making plans, whispering promises. But as the weeks passed, his messages began to diminish, the dates began to be cancelled, and his eyes no longer held the same sparkle. Laura slowly realized that what she had believed to be passion was merely a reflection of her own emptiness. A shallow enchantment, fueled by beautiful words and forbidden moments. One day, alone in the clinic after her last appointment, she decided to write a letter. Not to send, just to express what hurt. She wrote everything, the mistakes, the silences, the ignored signals, the guilt. She cried. But the greatest pain would come soon after. One Sunday afternoon, Laura went out to buy some groceries, and as she entered a downtown coffee shop, her eyes met an image that stopped her in her tracks. Sitting at a sidewalk table, smiling lightly, was Daniel. He was holding a woman's hand. Not just any stranger, but someone with soft features, a serene gaze, and a firm presence. Laura watched them for a few seconds. The woman laughed naturally, and Daniel looked at her with a peace she no longer remembered. The touch was subtle, but full of affection. And in that moment, Laura felt something collapse inside her. It wasn't jealousy. It was loss. A real, irreparable loss. She returned home with tears in her eyes and a tight chest. It was the confirmation she never wanted to face, Daniel was moving on. For real. 2 days later, Laura summoned the courage to write to him. Not on impulse, but because she had to. The message was brief, unapologetic. She simply asked him to meet her for a chat, without promises or intentions. Daniel hesitated. He considered ignoring her. But something inside him, perhaps a long-held respect, perhaps a desire to end that cycle with dignity, made him accept. They arranged to meet in a secluded park, where silence could embrace what words couldn't express. She arrived first. She sat on a bench under a large tree and waited. When she saw him approaching, her heart raced. Daniel walked with firm steps, but his gaze was distant. He sat beside her, leaving a respectful space between them. The initial silence was long and uncomfortable. Laura broke it with difficulty, her voice choked with the words she carried. She said she had no right to ask for anything, but she needed to say she was sorry. That what she experienced with the other man wasn't love, it was unresolved need. She said she thought something was missing, but only now realized it was in her, not him. And that he had been the most honest, most genuine man she had ever had by her side. Daniel listened silently, his gaze fixed on the fallen leaves on the ground. When she fell silent, he took a deep breath and calmly replied that he already knew, that her absence had begun long before the betrayal. He said he forgave her, not for her sake, but for his own. That he needed to free himself from the pain he carried. Laura wept silently. She said she still loved him. That if he wanted, they could try again. But when she heard his answer, the world seemed to spin in another direction. Daniel looked her in the eye for the first time in that conversation. There was firmness in his voice, but also compassion. He told her something important had happened. Something she needed to know. He took a deep breath and explained that, after all that, one morning, while he was still trying to understand his own pain, he had received an unexpected message. It came from a woman he didn't know. A woman he'd thought he had no connection to until then. But she said something that left him breathless. She said she knew who he was. That she recognized him in a photo Laura had posted. That she was married to the man who had placed the ring on her hand that night. Laura frowned, not understanding. Daniel continued. He said that, initially, he thought it was some kind of mistake, or a cruel attempt at provocation. But the woman sent proof. Screenshots of messages, intimate photos, details of conversations. She said her husband had confessed everything. That he had been in a relationship with Laura while he was still with her. He said Laura wasn't the only one. That there were others. Many. And that, after discovering the betrayal, she decided to expose everything. Not out of revenge, but because she believed the people involved deserved to know. And, in that moment, Daniel understood the extent of the destruction Laura had caused, not just in his life, but in others as well. Laura was shocked. She tried to deny it, but Daniel was clear. He said he didn't want to hear excuses. That he wasn't there to discuss versions. He said he didn't hate her. That he understood that human beings make mistakes, get lost, get confused. But he also said that, in that moment, there in front of her, he clearly realized she never really knew him. That, if she had, she would know he would never have stayed in a relationship where love was one-sided. He said he had met someone. That he was at peace. And that, for the first time in a long time, he felt he was being loved completely, without leftovers. Laura wept silently, paralyzed. His words were like mirrors. They showed the naked, raw truth, impossible to refuse. She tried to hold his hand, but he gently pulled away. He said forgiveness was granted, but their time was up. That what was between them now was just a memory. And that sometimes the greatest proof of love is letting go. He stood up, looked at her one last time, and walked away, without looking back. Laura stood there, alone on the park bench, her world spinning inside her. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of an illusion. Of a path built on lies. Of selfish choices. And, above all, of the only certainty that still sustained her, that she could return. Now she knew. There was no going back. Because some losses can't be healed. They can only be learned from. Laura stood there for over an hour after Daniel had left, motionless on the wooden bench, now cold in the growing shade of the trees. The park, which had once seemed a place of possible reconciliation, now transformed into a scene of closure, a silent stage where spoken words weighed more heavily than the silence that followed. Cars passed in the distance, people walked hurriedly, lives went on, indifferent to the quiet destruction of a heart that only now understood the extent of its own error. Laura couldn't move. Her trembling hands rested in her lap, her eyes fixed on the leaf-covered ground, as if searching in every color for the meaning that had been lost. She tried to mentally reorganize everything Daniel had said, every word, every pause, every averted glance. The betrayal of the man she thought she knew had left deep scars, but what hurt most wasn't what he had done, it was what she herself had caused. She had been complicit in something dirty without knowing it, and worse, she had given her own heart to someone who had no intention of holding it carefully. That night, Laura didn't go straight home. She drove aimlessly, passing streets she'd known since adolescence, parking in front of places she and Daniel had frequented, as if every corner still held the energy of an untouchable past. She stopped in front of the old bookstore where they used to choose books together, went inside, feigned interest in the shelves, but the weight of nostalgia suffocated her. Every room where his name seemed to echo now hurt her with a gentle violence. She returned to the car with red eyes, started the engine, and, for the first time since the breakup, realized no one was waiting for her. The loneliness of that realization was cruel, a cold that didn't come from outside. The following week, Laura tried to bury herself in work, increasing her caseload, immersing herself in volunteer shifts, and participating in study groups. She tried to fill every minute with anything that would keep her mind off things, but her mind was treacherous and found loopholes. During sessions with patients, she heard stories of loss, abandonment, and rash decisions, and despite her professional demeanor, she felt exposed in each account. She could no longer counsel with the same firmness, for she now understood, firsthand, that some choices truly cannot be undone, and that the pain of regret cannot be healed with well-placed words. A few days later, she crossed paths with the betrayed wife of the man she'd been involved with. The encounter was accidental, but the impact was immediate. They were in the same coffee shop, and upon recognizing her, Laura froze. The other woman, with a sober posture and a steady gaze, approached without hesitation. There was no anger on her face, but a calm that was even more unsettling. They sat in silence, as if they both understood this had to happen. The conversation that followed was brief, direct, and painfully honest. The woman said she wasn't seeking revenge, that she didn't wish any harm, but that Laura needed to understand something: she had been just another man. He said this without cruelty, but with the clarity of someone who didn't want to sugarcoat the truth. Laura, devastated, apologized, but heard, with a lucidity that crushed her, that asking for forgiveness didn't change the consequences. After that encounter, Laura began to relive all the scenes that led to the betrayal. She tried to understand at what point her gaze on Daniel stopped being the same. At what point her daily affection was replaced by a search for novelty, for validation, for something she couldn't even name. She relived the dinners, the outings, the nights she lay beside him with her heart already elsewhere. And the cruelest thing of all was realizing that, in all those moments, he kept trying. He hadn't been a perfect husband, no one is, but he remained there, present, willing, still believing in something she had already left behind. And when he finally realized something was wrong, he chose to trust, even with his stomach churning with the evidence. Laura knew that kind of love wasn't common. That the world was full of lukewarm, self-serving, cold relationships. And she had something rare, and destroyed it. She could no longer eat properly. Friends tried to convince her to go out, to distract herself, but she refused every invitation. It was no longer pride or shame, it was pure pain. A silent pain that found no rest. One night, lying alone in the bed where they had once slept, Laura missed the silence Daniel created when he arrived home tired from work. It was a silence with presence, one that said, "I'm here," even without words. She missed the spontaneous jokes, the way he fiddled with his cutlery when he thought, the way he adjusted the sheets before bed. Every detail was now a living absence. Without a second thought, she got up in the middle of the night, grabbed her phone, and typed a long message, but didn't send it. She reread it dozens of times. She deleted it. She wrote again. She knew it would be pointless. That he wouldn't respond. Or that, if he did, it wouldn't be what she wanted to hear. Because Daniel was consistent. He wouldn't go back on something he buried with such effort. She knew he wouldn't give in to the sentimentality of the moment. And that hurt her even more. Because now she wanted exactly what she'd thrown away, and he was no longer hers. A few days later, I learned from mutual friends that Daniel was living with his new partner. That they seemed happy. That they traveled together, that they had adopted a dog, that neighbors said they were both calm and harmonious, and that he seemed like a man at peace. And that last sentence was the one that hurt the most. Because Laura knew he had never found peace with her. She loved him, yes, but in a fickle way, sometimes full of doubt, other times with too much love and too little presence. And now he found what she had never been able to offer: balance, serenity, a love free of guilt. On a final impulse, she decided to go to the house where he was living. She wanted to see him, even if it was from afar. She arrived on a gray morning, parked the car across the street, and stood there, watching. The door opened. Daniel appeared, his hair slightly disheveled, a cup of coffee in his hand. Beside him, his new wife appeared, barefoot, smiling. He said something, she laughed. Then he hugged her, unhurriedly, with a tenderness visible from afar. The kind of hug you give not out of obligation, but out of desire. Laura felt her hands sweat. A tear ran down her face, but she didn't wipe it away. She stood there, watching the scene, motionless, knowing that this was the end of all hope. He had started over. With another love. With another woman. With another future. She started the car, turned around, and this time, for the first time, there was nothing left inside her but the absolute certainty of what she had lost. No anger, no attempts to win him back, no fantasizing. Just the naked pain of knowing that the love of her life was gone. And that he would never return. And it was only then, on that lonely bend on the way home, that Laura fully understood what Daniel had meant when he said, "I loved you with all my heart." Because now, without him, she understood the value of a love like that. A love that required no effort to exist, that gave itself without charge, that was present even on the quietest days. And that kind of love, she now knew, only comes once in a lifetime. And when we choose to turn away, life doesn't always offer a second chance. Laura spent the following days in absolute silence, not only externally but internally as well. It was as if her mind had given up trying to find explanations, justifications, or solutions. There were no longer any organized thoughts or poorly constructed plans to win Daniel back. What remained now was a barren field within her, a land where love once existed, but where, after so many wrong choices, nothing flourished. She no longer cried every day, as before, because she reached a point where her body simply stops responding. There is a limit to mourning, and after it comes the silent, uncomfortable acceptance that there is nothing left to mourn, only to live with what has been done. The attempts at distraction, the professional commitments, the insistent invitations from colleagues to reconnect with social life, everything seemed distant, colorless, as if it belonged to another reality. She was now someone living on the margins of her own existence, watching everything as if no longer part of the story that continues to unfold around her. Time, as always, followed its indifferent course. The seasons began to change, the clothes in the closets were exchanged without enthusiasm, family commitments were fulfilled with robotic cordiality. One cloudy morning, Laura received an invitation to a charity event organized by former university classmates. Initially, she considered declining, but decided to attend, as if seeking some form of reconnection with what was left of herself. Arriving there, she noticed that the atmosphere seemed out of place for her current emotional state, people smiling too much, talking loudly, laughing for trivial reasons. She watched from a distance, trying to blend in, until she saw a familiar couple entering the room. It was Daniel. With her. The woman with gentle gestures, a transparent gaze, and a voice that exuded effortless naturalness. Laura couldn't look away. They chatted with the other guests calmly, and although they didn't display exaggerated affection, there was something in the way they looked at each other that betrayed a deep connection. It wasn't the kind of impatient passion at the beginning of a relationship, but rather the kind of intimacy that only arises when there's complicity. Laura took a deep breath, swallowed the urge to run away, and remained there, standing still, as if accepting the life she couldn't preserve. When Daniel saw her, it was inevitable. Their eyes met. He didn't look away. He held her gaze respectfully, with the same firmness he'd had when they'd said goodbye in that park. She smiled briefly, more as an attempt to appear pleasant than out of genuine desire. He returned it with a barely perceptible nod and then returned to his conversation with the woman beside him. Laura didn't try to get closer. There was nothing left to say. The image of the two of them together was the materialization of a page turned. When she finally left the place, she was certain, it was no longer a matter of winning back, it was a matter of starting over, but a starting over that would have to happen alone, without the illusion of return. In the days that followed, she reflected deeply on the words of the betrayed woman she had confronted, on the silent glances that now surrounded her at social gatherings, on the uncomfortable loneliness she felt even surrounded by people. She began to write compulsively, not letters to Daniel, but reflections on choices, desires, impulses, loyalty, and the weight of small decisions that, combined, drag a love toward the abyss. She wrote as if trying to understand herself with the same dedication with which she listened to her patients. She began to recognize that the most serious mistake wasn't cheating, but underestimating the value of someone who loved her completely while she distracted herself with emotional crumbs that seemed more exciting. One day, while organizing an old drawer, she found a small box filled with wedding mementos. Inside were small objects that had once represented joy, the ribbon from the bouquet, the note from their first dinner after saying, "I do," a card in his handwriting thanking her for choosing him as her husband. She read those words as if reading a letter from a dead man. Daniel wasn't dead, of course, but the Daniel who'd waited for her with dinner ready, who'd put on her favorite music in the background just to watch her dance in the kitchen, the man who still believed she was the love of his life, that was no more. And what hurt most was knowing that it was she who'd killed him, slowly, with neglect, with silence, with the kind of coldness that doesn't come from a single mistake, but from the sum of daily absences. She set the box aside, leaned against the bedroom wall, and let the weight of reality suffocate her for a few minutes. She had reached rock bottom. And there was no longer Daniel waiting for her on the surface. Meanwhile, Daniel's life continued at a steady but serene pace. His new partner wasn't spectacular in the media sense of the word, but she was consistent. She had a habit of listening deeply, laughing at the simplest things, and expressing admiration without exaggeration. Daniel felt that, for the first time, he didn't have to constantly prove himself. There was no feeling of walking through an emotional minefield, nor the need to reclaim an affection that was slipping through his fingers. With her, everything was lighter, and although he still carried some scars from the past, Daniel was learning to love again without fear. One day, while they were walking together, she asked if he regretted anything. He answered honestly, no. Because even the mistake he suffered led him to her, and sometimes, certain pains need to happen for us to recognize when something is truly worth it. In her office, Laura began to notice that her treatments had changed. She no longer spoke theoretically about feelings, now she spoke with deep empathy. When someone described the pain of loss through betrayal, she didn't just understand, she felt it with them. When a patient said she believed she'd lost the right man through a bad choice, Laura didn't offer advice, she just listened. She knew that sometimes, the most comforting thing is listening to someone who knows the abyss. One day, a woman sitting across from her said, through tears, that she'd rather have been abandoned than be the one who abandoned someone and regrets it later. And at that moment, Laura simply replied, her voice low and choked, that yes, that is the worst form of loss. Because those who leave can even come back. But those who destroy, sometimes, have to learn to live with the rubble. One afternoon, walking alone through the neighborhood streets, Laura passed a lady selling flowers. She was the same lady Daniel used to buy sunflowers from on random dates, just because. He stopped, bought a small bouquet, and took it home. He placed it in the center of the table, stared at it for several minutes, and then, in a symbolic gesture, sat down at the table and wrote a final letter. This time, not to Daniel, but to herself. It was a farewell. She wrote everything she had learned, everything she should never have done, and everything she wished to forgive herself. At the end, she signed with her own name, as if closing a cycle not for lack of options, but for maturity. On the other side of town, Daniel continued with the simple life he had built. He planted crops, cared for his dog, wrote new projects, and learned from his new partner the art of living one day at a time. Every now and then, amidst his routine, he remembered Laura. But not with anger, nor with a desire for a reunion. He remembered her the way one remembers an important book from his youth, intense, powerful, full of chapters that taught a lot, but which has since been returned to the shelf. And that was what now separated them: time, choices, and, above all, consequences. Because love, when mistreated, doesn't die suddenly. It slowly drifts away until it no longer recognizes the one it once loved so dearly. On that rainy October morning, Laura decided to go out aimlessly for the first time in a long time. She put on a loose coat, tied her hair back haphazardly, and walked uncertainly through the wet streets. The city seemed different beneath the heavy gray clouds, and there was something about the atmosphere that matched what she felt, a heavy, yet undesperate, inner silence. The movement of cars, the drops running down the windows, umbrellas crossing in the hurried flow of sidewalks, everything seemed to move at a different time than her own. She entered a small gallery, climbed ancient stairs, and found herself in a painting studio. Through the half-open door, she watched a silent class taking place. Students concentrated on their canvases, an instructor walking lightly between easels, gently correcting with his gaze. Laura stood there for a few minutes, feeling like an intruder in a place of reconstruction. For the first time, he thought about doing something new, not to escape the pain, but perhaps to reconnect with parts of himself that he had abandoned while trying to maintain an image that no longer existed. Later, passing a newsstand, she spotted a magazine with an article on mature relationships and new beginnings. The cover image showed a couple back-to-back, walking hand in hand down a tree-lined road. That made her stop. She bought the magazine and sat down at a nearby coffee shop. Flipping through the pages, she came across an article by Daniel. He wrote about conscious affection, the importance of emotional reciprocity, and how small daily gestures sustain true bonds. The text was sensitive, without resentment, but there was a painful maturity within the words, of someone who only achieves serenity after traversing ruins. Laura read each paragraph carefully and, when she finished, leaned back in her chair, staring at the now cold cup of coffee in front of her. He was living, creating, writing about love, and that, in a way, was the clearest answer to where he was and where she was no longer. One night that same week, Laura was surprised by a message from Daniel's sister. They hadn't been in touch since their breakup, so the gesture unsettled her. The message was short but carried weight: "I'd like to talk. That's all. When I can." After a long hesitation, she decided to respond, and the next day they met at a discreet cafe in the old neighborhood where she and Daniel had lived together early in their marriage. His sister was visibly uncomfortable, but there was something in her gaze that wasn't judgment, it was a kind of compassionate sadness, perhaps even empathy. Laura heard her say that, despite everything, she had decided to reach out because, deep down, she believed the history between her and Daniel had left too many scars to ignore. She said she saw firsthand how much he suffered, how there were nights when she only heard him breathing without sleep, how she wrote and rewrote letters she never sent. She said she wasn't there to reopen wounds, but because she believed that, to move forward with dignity, sometimes you have to look into the eyes of those you once were, and Laura needed to know that. The conversation didn't last much longer. Laura thanked her emotionally and returned home with a strange sense of relief. It wasn't forgiveness, nor reconciliation, but a kind of closure that only happens when both parties involved accept that the story, however painful, existed and left something beyond the pain. Daniel, for his part, continued to navigate his life with delicacy. One afternoon, while visiting a bookstore where he usually bought old novels, he was approached by an older man who said he recognized his name from the latest publication. They began talking about literature, life experiences, and little by little, Daniel began to realize that, even with everything he had been through, he was still capable of establishing new connections, new affections. These weren't just new romantic relationships, but new versions of himself being built, brick by brick, outside of Laura's shadow. His new partner, Clara, was part of this, but not the reason. Daniel had learned not to place his entire emotional universe in someone else's hands. Now he knew that healthy love doesn't require sacrificing identity, but rather mutual respect for differences and each other's unique spaces. Later, during a weekend in the countryside with Clara, the two walked through an open field at dusk. The orange-pink sky contrasted with the green of the hills, and there was an almost cinematic peace in the air. Daniel stopped, stared at the horizon for a few minutes, and said quietly that he no longer expected to understand all of life's events, but that there was something liberating in finally letting go of wanting answers to everything. Clara simply squeezed his hand and smiled. That was it. A kind of love that doesn't require questions, just presence. Back in the city, Laura finally signed up for the painting classes she had observed days before. At first, she felt out of place. The other students seemed lighter, more settled, and she carried with her an emotional depth that sometimes spilled over into the lines on her canvases. She painted scenes of places that existed only in dreams, faces that recalled people who had passed through her life, gestures she wished she had experienced differently. The teacher, noticing the emotional power of her compositions, commented that there was truth there, and that, often, it is from truth that the best artistic expressions are born. Laura wasn't seeking recognition, but feeling that there was still something inside her that could be transformed into beauty was comforting. At one of these meetings, one of the students commented on a column she had recently read in a literary magazine, the same one written by Daniel. Laura listened silently, without revealing her connection, but realized that his work was touching others. It made her reflect on how pain can generate something noble when channeled sensitively. She wondered if one day she herself would be able to do something like that, not to try to erase the past, but to make it living, transformative material. One night of light rain, when Laura arrived home, she found an envelope with no return address under her door. It was a drawing. A quick pencil sketch. It was her, sitting on a park bench, her face slightly lowered, her hair tied up awkwardly. In the corner of the paper, just one word was written, gratitude. She didn't know who it was from. It could have been a patient, someone who saw her and was touched, or simply an anonymous gesture. But it touched her deeply. Perhaps because it was the first sign that, even in a downfall, it was still possible to touch others in a positive way. She taped the drawing to the living room wall, next to a phrase she became a mantra of, learning to love is also learning to lose. Daniel, on a typical Sunday morning, was making pancakes while Clara organized books on the couch. The radio played an old song softly, and the smell of coffee filled the kitchen. He stopped for a moment, looked around, and smiled to himself. There was no more pain. There were scars, yes, marks that told of where he came from, but there was also an undeniable peace in the way life now presented itself. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, nor seek validation of his own worth from another person. He had been betrayed, disappointed, shattered. But he had also been healed, rebuilt, renewed. And now, finally, he was whole. Maybe not as before, maybe better. Laura, on her own journey, wasn't yet in the same place. But for the first time in months, I knew she was moving forward. No longer in circles, no longer chasing shadows or trying to rewrite what had already been experienced. Now she accepted. And accepting wasn't giving up, it was growing. She learned to be alone without feeling abandoned, to look at her own mistakes without trying to justify herself. And that, in itself, was a new beginning. Love stories, when real, don't end with a farewell. They continue to echo, shape, and touch those who remain. And sometimes, even when there's no return, there's a lesson to be learned. And in their case, the greatest lesson of all was understanding that love only lasts when it's cared for, nurtured, and, above all, respected. Because when you choose to let go of it, it's not just the other person who's lost, it's also a part of you that will never be the same again. The months passed like someone who doesn't ask for permission, simply pushing life forward, unconcerned with what was left behind. What had once been a raw, unbearable pain now became a more discreet weight, like a weariness that no longer required tears, but only silence. Laura began to live with a greater awareness of time, limits, and choices. Not that she had forgotten the past, on the contrary, it remained present in every action, but now as a warning, not as motivation. She had learned to live with what she had lost without trying to rescue it, and her inner reconstruction didn't occur with explosions or dramatic turns, but with small, everyday gestures. She painted more and more, wrote reflections she would never publish, and listened to her patients with a listening ear that carried the bitter wisdom of someone who had traversed emotional deserts. She had become a calmer, but less innocent, woman, and was no longer driven by the need to be loved, but by the responsibility of no longer hurting those who trusted her. One sunny morning, she was invited to give a talk at a conference on human relationships and new beginnings. Initially, she was reluctant. She felt she still carried the stain of betrayal, that perhaps her story wasn't worthy of being heard by someone seeking hope. But after much reflection, she understood that precisely because she had made so many mistakes, she could offer a perspective that wasn't theoretical, but real. She took the stage in a simple dress, her hair delicately tied back, and began her speech bluntly. She spoke of the pain of destroying one's home, the loneliness of no longer being recognized by those she loves, and the price of abandoning true love in the name of a fleeting impulse. She said that guilt wasn't a life sentence, but a sign that there were still values to be rescued. At the end of her presentation, she received a standing ovation. Not for her eloquence, but for her truth. As she was leaving, a woman approached her and said, her eyes welling up, "You put into words everything I never had the courage to admit." Laura was grateful, but that day she understood something even more profound, that even the most serious mistakes, when faced honestly, can shed some light on someone's path. Daniel, for his part, was consolidating a new stage in his life with the serenity of someone who has weathered a storm and emerged on the other side not unscathed, but whole. Alongside Clara, he built a modest house on the outskirts of town. They tended the garden together, exchanged books in the late afternoons, and on Sundays cooked new recipes as a ritual of sharing. There was no grandeur, just constancy. Daniel no longer spoke of Laura, not because he wanted to erase her, but because it was no longer necessary. What needed to be understood had already been understood, and now his attention was fully focused on the present. One day, Clara asked him if he still believed in love. He responded with a calm smile that, in truth, he only truly came to believe after everything he had experienced. Because love, to be real, must survive truth, time, and pain. Any feeling that doesn't withstand this is perhaps just an illusion with an expiration date. And as fate never fails to weave unlikely encounters, it was precisely at a literary cafe, during the launch of an anthology of chronicles, that Daniel and Laura's paths crossed one last time. She was there at the invitation of a writer friend, he as a guest author. When their eyes met, there was no tension, no pain. Only recognition. They sat at a secluded table for a few minutes. They spoke civilly, without needing to rehash the past. Daniel asked if she was okay, and Laura, with a sincere smile, answered yes. She said she had learned a lot, that she still learned every day, and that she was rooting for him. Daniel nodded, saying he was fine too, and that he hoped she felt at peace with who she had become. There was no hug, no promises, no insinuations. Just two people who had once loved each other deeply and were now in different places in life, finally at peace with their stories. That same night, when she got home, Laura sat on the sofa and took a deep breath. She looked at the painting she had painted weeks before, a half-open window with light streaming in. It was symbolic. The pain she had caused had been irreparable, yes, but the lesson she had left was perhaps the most valuable thing she had left. She finally understood that when you betray a true love, you don't just lose the person, you also lose the right to be the same person again. Because love, when carelessly wounded, doesn't mend over time. It transforms, fades, grows distant. And what remains is not shallow regret, but the profound awareness that some loves, once lost, are forever. Daniel, at that very moment, was writing a new text. Sitting at his wooden desk, with the light dimmed and the soft sound of rain hitting the window, he wrote about rebirth. About how pain, when respected and endured, becomes ground. He said that some love stories don't end because love ends, but because respect disappears. And without respect, no love survives. When he finished, he closed the notebook, walked to the room where Clara slept, and lay down beside her with the tranquility of someone who knows that, this time, he is exactly where he should be. Now, we want to hear from you who've followed this story so far. What did you think of the ending? What part struck you the most? Leave your comment below, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to receive the next stories, which, like this one, are built to move you, engage you and, above all, make you reflect. This story profoundly showed us how betrayal not only destroys the other person, but also corrodes the perpetrator. It shatters dreams, kills affections, and often destroys the only real chance at happiness someone might have. No one emerges unscathed. The pain may pass, but the memory of the wrong choice remains, throbs, and changes the way we see ourselves forever. Therefore, our channel once again leaves the message clear: we do not support any kind of betrayal. Here, we tell stories to show that fidelity isn't a prison, it's respect, it's choice, it's true love. Until the next story.